Hi, and welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog Horticulture Technologies and Consulting. You're here with Kevin and Noah. We're here to talk about everything having to do with indoor cannabis cultivation and cultivation in general. Obviously, a little focus on lighting with Black Dog. But thanks for joining us for another episode of Cultivation Cast. We've had some really good guests lately, but we thought we would dive back into one of our older formats where we don't have a guest and we talk about a specific topic. So there's been a lot of talk and some questions about ultraviolet UV lately, and so we wanted to take advantage of that and do a little bit of a deep dive into UV specifically. So for those of you that asked, thanks for the questions, and do please keep those questions coming. They help us understand what it is you want to learn about or where we should spend some time during the cultivation cast. So Kevin is the guy who designs our spectrum here at Black Dog. He's the one that's refined it over about 15 years and really made it what it is today. Because not only do we offer what we call a more targeted spectrum versus what we refer to as a basic white spectrum, most of the lights out there are going to be white LEDs and just a little bit of red to dope it, maybe help in flowering. Whereas we use a number of different LEDs to target our spectrum. And one of the things we include is UV. Part of the reason we include UV is because it offers benefits you just can't get out of the other colors. A lot of the other colors you can play around and do different things, but basically UV offers some benefits you just can't get elsewhere, and it is found in nature. So we're just taking advantage of something already found in nature. So we want to explore this topic a little bit more. We're going to cover what UV is, why we use it, what it can do for you, what it can't do for you, and we'll even close out by talking a little bit about what to look for because there are more UV products coming on the market, and we've seen some, let's say, deficiencies, right, to say the least, and we'll cover those at the end, so definitely stick around for that. So why don't we just start out today, Kevin, by you giving a definition. UV, which is an abbreviation for ultraviolet, it is a definitive term. It actually means something. There are terms thrown around in our industry, such as full spectrum, our personal favorite, that actually are a marketing term and have no scientific meaning at all. They mean nothing. It's just a cool marketing term to throw around, words like full spectrum. But UV does mean something. So let's talk about this. What does UV actually mean, Kevin, ultraviolet?
Yeah, so ultraviolet is defined generally as the wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum, which our eyes perceive as light, but it extends far beyond the light that we can see with our eyes, both in the shorter wavelengths and the longer wavelengths. So we can perceive, for example, infrared electromagnetic radiation or infrared light. Even though we can't see it as light, we can perceive it as heat. With ultraviolet, we don't really have the capability of seeing it at all. And it's defined as 100 to 400 nanometers. So the visible spectrum, the light our eyes can see, is generally defined as 400 to 700 nanometers. So ultraviolet has a shorter wavelength than that, or more energetic. The shorter the wavelength is, the more energetic the radiation is. So within ultraviolet, there's three commonly used subdivisions of ultraviolet light. One is from 100 to 280 nanometers, and this is called UVC, or ultraviolet C. One is from 280 to roughly 315, some people say 320 nanometers. That's called UVB. And then UVA light is from 315 to 400 nanometers. And how they ended up with these three different buckets or bins of UV is kind of has to do with Earth's atmosphere. So UVC light is so short in wavelength and so energetic that it is readily absorbed by our atmosphere. Basically, none of the UVC light that the sun puts off actually makes it to the Earth's surface. It is all absorbed, and you never see it at Earth's surface. Now, if you go up in space, you have to worry about it because our atmosphere isn't protecting you anymore, so you would be exposed to UVC in space, which is one of the reasons why the astronauts have really good protective visors on their helmets, because UVC is also known as sterilizing radiation. It is energetic enough that basically if it hits DNA, it will cause the DNA to break apart, and that pretty quickly kills things. So UVC is actually very useful in sterilizing applications. So for example, if you want to sterilize water, you can shine UVC light through it, and that will kill any bacteria that happen to be in the water. Any bacteria, viruses, anything. It sterilizes everything.
And so, real quick, this is why we saw a lot of talk about UVC post-COVID and during COVID, because they started using it more in hospitals and to sterilize things. So you've seen, a lot of us have seen the phone sterilizers, right? And that's all going to be mostly UVC in there to sterilize?
So there were a lot of bunk products put out, especially during COVID, where, anything UV, I mean, it could be UVA, and they would call it a sterilizer. Especially anything that is LED based. If it claims to be a UVC LED that is sterilizing stuff, well, UVC LEDs do exist, but they're ridiculously expensive and they have a very short lifespan at the moment. They have not perfected that technology yet. So UVC LEDs are very unlikely to be in any commercial products.
So real quick, let's point out though, because you already brought this up, that there's a lot of different things out there that we can measure with high-end instruments, but most people don't have those. IR, as you said, infrared, I can feel. If I put my hand under a heating lamp, I can feel it. I can't see the IR, but I can feel it. UV offers a unique challenge in that, and we're going to come back to this a few times, in that there's a lot of claims around it, but there's really no way for you to know if you're getting UVA or UVC. Yes, you're here to tell us those LEDs, UVC, are really expensive and have a short lifetime, so they're probably not in there. But there's no way to test that without a very expensive meter. I can't put my hand next to it. I can't test it. And if it is really UVC, the last thing I want to do is put my hand right next to it. So there's really no way to know what you're getting.
Well, with UVC, there is a sheet in that UVC generally is high enough energy that it will break apart oxygen molecules in the atmosphere. And those oxygen molecules then recombine to form ozone. So if you're familiar with the rather pungent smell of ozone, if you're around a ultraviolet emitting device and you smell ozone, then it is probably putting off UVC. Now, if you're around an ultraviolet C emitting device, you may want to make sure and get out of the room, because A, ozone is not good for you, and B, UVC light is not good for you. You do not want to get it on your skin. It causes burns, severe burns, at rather low doses, and longer exposure will cause your skin to basically die and start peeling off. So it's not very good for your eyes either. It causes cataracts. UVC light is something you don't want to be exposed to. And in fact, there are some products being marketed right now as room sterilizers that unfortunately are basically just UVC bulbs, bare UVC bulbs that I've seen infomercials for, and people are talking about how fresh their room smells after they run it. Well, yeah, that's all the ozone it's generating. Basically, it's generating smog in your room to kill everything, and I would not want to take the chance of, I mean, any living material in the room that's exposed to UVC is going to get damaged.
So then we could probably stop talking about UVC, because it shouldn't be deployed in a garden, because it's going to literally kill your plants if you deployed it in any meaningful amounts in a garden somehow. So the one thing I'm lucky enough to get to spend a lot of time with Kevin, and I have heard him talk about, there is actually a place UVC is used in horticulture on a regular basis intentionally to kill some of the plants, and that's in roses. Just so those that are following this, that are plant nerds, can learn a little bit about this.
So if you get the dose just right, UVC light can be applied in a greenhouse, for example, to hopefully kill just the outer layer of the leaf, along with any fungi that might be living on the outer layer. So if you have powdery mildew, for example, and you want to deploy UVC to kill it, you can. Now, it's going to damage the leaf and therefore damage the plant as well. And if you get the dose wrong, you're either not going to do enough to kill the powdery mildew, or you're going to outright kill your plants and possibly give yourself cancer. So it's not something that I would ever recommend unless you're in really large agricultural situations and you really know what you're doing.
Okay, so there is a use for UVC, but it's fairly limited in horticulture.
So another use for UVC in the cannabis industry, for example, is during the drying and curing process. If you're experiencing issues with mold and you want to sterilize it and make sure you don't have any mold, you can expose it to UVC, and that will kill any mold that the light can actually get to. It also, though, is energetic enough that it can break down other chemical compounds, so you're probably going to see some degradation in terms of the terpenes and the anthocyanins and pigmentation and other cannabinoids.
Yeah. All right, so UVC, interesting. You were going through the bucket. So now we understand UVC is the dangerous one that luckily doesn't make it to the Earth's surface.
Yes. So, yeah, just tens of feet of Earth's atmosphere will absorb all the UVC. So, thankfully, we're not exposed to that from the sun. UVB, defined as 280 to 315 nanometers, only makes it through the Earth's atmosphere right around local solar noon. So when the sun is highest up in the sky and it's got the least amount of atmosphere to go through and the least amount of the ozone layer to go through, UVB light can get through. Now, the amount of UVB light that comes through is very tiny. At noon, in a normal spot on Earth, about 5% of the ultraviolet light, not total light, but just the ultraviolet light that makes it to Earth's surface, is UVB, and 95% is UVA. Now, on either side of noon, the amount of UVB drops dramatically because as the sun is changing angle in the Earth's atmosphere, it has to go through more atmosphere. The light has to go through more atmosphere to reach us, and it has to go through more of the ozone layer, and the ozone layer is particularly good at absorbing UVB. So just a couple hours on either side of noon, you basically get almost no UVB reaching the Earth's surface, which is good because UVB is strong enough to cause issues with DNA as well. It can break apart DNA, not as quickly or as readily as UVC, but it can happen, which is why UVB is very good at giving you sunburns. That's why you're much more likely to get a sunburn if you're out in the sun around noon than you are, saying, starting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not to say you still can't get a burn with enough exposure, but UVB is generally not required by a lot of organisms. There are exceptions. Some reptiles actually need exposure to UVB to trigger their bodies to produce certain compounds. So without basking in the sun and getting a certain dose of UVB, some reptiles, can actually get sick over time if they're not exposed to UVB. So you do see UVB being used in what are called reptile bulbs available at pet stores. But for the most part, UV that you walk into a store and buy in terms of a fluorescent tube that is emitting UV is generally known as a black light, is generally UVA radiation. There are other exceptions to this. UVB, because it is more energetic, gives you a tan faster and also burns you faster. But if you go to a tanning salon, chances are if you sit in one of those tanning beds, you're being exposed to a lot of UVB because it gives you a tan faster than UVA will, at the risk of getting a burn faster as well.
Now, I would point out there is historically one company in our industry that did offer an LED fixture with the addition of UVB reptile bulbs, the reptile bulbs you're talking about, out on the side that was run a separate circuit and all that. So we have seen them used in horticulture.
So, and a lot of this comes back to a very interesting study that somehow was funded by the federal government back in 1986. On how ultraviolet light affects the production of cannabinoids in cannabis plants. And they did this study, again, 1986. The instrumentation that we have now, I mean, right now I can not walk down to a store, but I can order online a spectroradiometer that will break apart the spectrum of light it sees very accurately. I mean, these things cost several $1,000s, so most people don't have one, but you can actually buy one of these instruments relatively cheaply at this point and see what spectrum of light you're actually getting. In 1986, spectroradiometers were extremely expensive to the point where most laboratories and research institutions wouldn't have one. So they did this study and they put a ultraviolet source, a broadband ultraviolet source, above some cannabis plants, and then they put filters underneath it. So the filter that was supposed to block the UVA light but let UVB light through actually let through all ultraviolet light, UVA and UVB. So they did their study with this filter that they believed was only letting UVB light through, and they saw that, hey, there's an increase in cannabinoids with exposure to what they believed was UVB light. However, the filter was letting through UVA and UVB. But they came to the conclusion in this study that because the UV exposed, where they believed they were only exposed to UVB, were having higher cannabinoid levels, they came to the conclusion that UVB light in particular was increasing cannabinoid levels. However, it was later shown that the filter they were using, which was cellulose acetate, actually didn't do what they were hoping it to do, and it let through UVA light as well. And so really what they proved is that with UVA light and UVB light, they were getting an increase in cannabinoids. We've done further studies showing that, yeah, with exposure to UVA light alone, without UVB, you can get the increase in cannabinoids. And there's several reasons why UVB is less than ideal in a growing environment. One is because it's so much stronger than UVA light, it only takes a little dose of UVB to get the effect you want. And if you overdo it, which is pretty easy to do, you start damaging the plant. You actually start damaging the DNA inside the plant. So that's where in the culture of cannabis, you might have heard of using UVB for just the last couple of weeks of flower. Because if you go down to your local pet shop or you buy one of these other fixtures that has a UVB reptile bulb in it, if you turn that on and put it above your plants for 12 hours a day, that's going to be way too much UVB. You're going to fry your plants and kill everything, which obviously you don't want. So people were only doing it for a few hours a day or even 15 minutes a day just for the last 3 weeks because they noticed, hey, if we're doing it early in flower, it's damaging the plants, it's causing issues, and they were getting less flower if they were doing that. So UVB is so powerful that it's really dangerous to work with, it's hard to get the right dose, and it's really easy to overdo it to the point of causing damage to your plants. So there's a commonly held belief in the cannabis growers out there that UV light is only ideal for the end of the flower cycle to increase quality because exposure to UV stimulates cannabis plants to create their own natural sunscreen, just like exposure to UV light stimulates our skin to produce its own natural sunscreen, melanin, which gives you a tan. With cannabis plants, they produce a variety of different compounds, including anthocyanins, which is the purple pigmentation. Those are natural sunscreen compounds. And it turns out that cannabinoids are also natural sunscreen compounds. And trichomes themselves are natural sunscreen structures. They're like little tiny umbrellas helping to shade the plant from ultraviolet. So as you expose a cannabis plant to ultraviolet light, it produces more of these terpenes, cannabinoids, and even more trichomes, and so it increases quality, which is why a lot of growers have been trying to expose their plants to light to increase to ultraviolet light to increase quality, but because they're doing it with UVB, they're only trying to do it the last 2 to 3 weeks of flower because they've noticed, hey, if we do it earlier in the flower cycle, it's actually hurting our yield.
Got it. So that it's interesting. There's a couple really interesting points you brought up there. One, you can use UVB to get the response we're looking for, which most of you watching this show, you're going to care about the cannabinoids, the terpenes, all that, the active compounds, as we just kind of blanket call them. You can do that, but if you use too much, not only are you adding them, but you're also hurting the plant and also degrading or breaking those compounds back down. So using too much can hurt the plant and be counterproductive. You're trying to layer on these cannabinoids and these terpenes, but you're breaking them down at the same time if you're using UVB. And the other thing also, us from the production and manufacturer standpoint, we want to keep the product at a good non-cost prohibitive cost point. And UVB, if you would explain also, I believe is going to be very expensive to buy the LEDs, and they're not going to last long, which is not good for our customers either. So again, UVB could add cost and decrease the lifespan of the light.
Yeah, at this point, the technology for ultraviolet LEDs, as I mentioned before, UVC LEDs exist, but they have a very short lifespan and they're very expensive. UVB LEDs exist. They have a longer lifespan than UVC LEDs, but it's still measured in the low thousands of hours, so 1,000 to 2,000 hours before they start degrading to the point where you're getting so little light out of them that it's not really worth it anymore. And they're still really expensive. UVA LEDs, on the other hand, have been around for long enough and enough research has been put into them that they are relatively common, relatively available, nowhere near as common or available as a white LED, which is really just a blue LED with a phosphor coating on top of it. But UVA LEDs are actually being used in industry for all sorts of different purposes. There's dental applications for them, there's lithographic applications for them. And now there's horticultural applications for them as well, because it turns out that it's not just increasing active compounds that comes along with exposure to ultraviolet light. If plants are exposed to ultraviolet light during vegetative growth, they actually change how they grow. Now, is ultraviolet light required for plants to grow, like some reptiles require ultraviolet light? No, plants can grow generally just fine without ultraviolet light exposure, but that doesn't mean that they're growing the same without ultraviolet light as they would if they were naturally growing outside with exposure to the sun's ultraviolet light. Because at the Earth's surface, generally about 3% of the photons that are hitting Earth's surface are in the ultraviolet range, and 95% of those at noon are in the ultraviolet A range, and 3 p.m., 99% of those are in the ultraviolet A range. So the vast majority of ultraviolet hitting the Earth's surface, about 3% of total photons, is in the UVA range.
And you've already touched on what the benefits, especially to cannabis growers, of deploying UV it can be, right? So, for example, we know that we can, and we've proven this through our own research, we can increase the quality from a scientific measurable standpoint of terpenes and other cannabinoids in there by applying UV in a proper way. That's why we have UV in our light, right?
That's not the only reason why, because exposure to ultraviolet during vegetative growth or throughout the plant's life cycle has other benefits as well. So, for example, plants exposed to ultraviolet light tend to remain shorter, more compact, and they develop a bushier or more laterally branching structure. So plants that are not exposed to UV tend to grow taller, a little lankier, with fewer side branches. And if you're growing a plant like bamboo that you want the stems, then maybe you don't want to expose it to UV because you want it to be tall and not have a lot of side branches. But if you're growing a plant like cannabis, those side branches are additional flowering sites, and you're not generally harvesting the cannabis plant for its stems, you're harvesting it for its flowers. So any energy that the plant is putting into growing taller stems is energy that it can't put into flowers. So maintaining a smaller, bushier, more compact plant that's wider and not tall, you end up with more flower sites and more flowers overall.
What about other benefits, as you like to say, knock-on benefits that are secondary, or even maybe in this case tertiary, in terms of plant health and or its ability to resist pests or disease?
Yep. So plants exposed to ultraviolet light also develop thicker cell walls. These thicker cell walls help protect the plant from ultraviolet light exposure, and they also help protect the plant from desiccation. Because you've got a thicker cell wall, it's harder for water to escape through that. So in dry environments or in drought conditions, the plant does not wilt as quickly if it has been exposed to ultraviolet light. These thicker cell walls also make it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to penetrate into that cell. So whether it's a piercing, sucking insect or powdery mildew, anything that's trying to get into the plant's leaf itself finds it a little harder to do if that leaf was exposed to ultraviolet and had grown with the ultraviolet exposure, that thicker cell wall. In addition, UVA light is not a sterilizing agent like UVC, but it does degrade spores and cells over time if they're not being replenished. So spores of powdery mildew over time, if they're just sitting on a surface, UVA will slowly kill them. Now this is not a 15 minutes and it's done thing. It takes days to actually kill powdery mildew spores. So UVA light is not a cure for powdery mildew or piercing, sucking insects, anything like that. However, it does make the plants more resistant to it. So if you maintain a clean environment, it just makes it less likely that you're going to have problems.
So now we know it costs a little bit more to put UV in our light. We know that it adds cost to the light, but we believe the benefits are there, and you've just gone over a lot of them. You've talked about that we're going to get a better structural plant in terms of how it grows and potentially increase yield because of that. Also better disease and pest resistance, and as we really covered, you have increased active compounds, hopefully more terpenes as well as cannabinoids. So now we've established really why we go through the effort of putting UV in, and I do say effort of putting UV into a light, because it's not this, you can't just throw it in there like a white LED, right? It's actually takes time, a lot of experience. We got 15 years of putting UV in lights and learning some tough lessons, but we've got all these benefits, but those are offset by the time, energy, and engineering that goes behind including it in the light. Can you speak a little bit to that in terms of what the challenges are with UV and why other manufacturers don't include it in their spectrum?
Absolutely. So ultraviolet LEDs have made great leaps in technology over the past 14 years that we've been in business. They've gotten way more efficient than they used to be. But there are definite challenges to them. So the vast majority of research into LEDs is going into improving the efficiency of visible light LEDs, because humans are using LEDs for our own visual purposes way more than we are for growing plants or generating ultraviolet light at this point. So the vast majority of research has been going into making blue LEDs in particular more efficient, because blue LEDs are the secret sauce underlying a white or so-called full spectrum LED. That's actually a blue LED with a phosphor coating on it that steals some energy from the blue photons and re-releases those photons as a lower energy, longer wavelength light, with whether it's green, yellow, orange, red. So a blue LED with a phosphor coating makes a perfect reading light for humans. It makes for perfect parking lot lights and lights in offices. And yes, I mean, the discovery of how to make an efficient blue LED won a Nobel Prize for a good reason. It has revolutionized lighting around the world. There's also a lot of research into red LEDs, because they're being used in stoplights and tail lights. And still, the biggest market for red LEDs is actually automotive. It's not horticultural, even though a lot of horticultural fixtures are actually starting to use a lot of red LEDs. They're using different wavelengths than typically are being used for taillights, because human eyes are not very good at seeing into the deep red into the spectrum. Basically, the further towards 700 nanometers you get in the spectrum, the less efficient our eyes are picking it up. So typically a red tail light in an automobile is putting out 630 nanometers, because that's where our eyes are most sensitive to red light. Whereas in horticultural applications, typically the 660 nanometer red LEDs are being used. So there's a lot of research going into those, and two of the big challenges with LEDs are keeping them cool, because as LEDs warm up, they get less efficient inherently. So when you're trying to put a bunch of little white LEDs into something to replace a light bulb, you need to keep them cool enough, or you need to re-engineer the LED so that it can tolerate being run warmer so it doesn't cause problems and lose efficiency. And the heat also causes the LED to break down over time. That's ultimately what ends up killing LEDs, is exposure to heat. So a lot of research has been done, and a lot of technological advances have been made in terms of making these red and blue LEDs more heat resistant. There's been a lot of research on doing that with ultraviolet LEDs as well, but not as many technological leaps have been made in that. And ultraviolet LEDs are still very much more sensitive to heat than white or red LEDs. So they require much better cooling to prevent them from degrading immediately, or even relatively quickly over a matter of just a few hundred hours of use. So there's a big challenge if you're putting ultraviolet LEDs into a grow light fixture, for example. You can have your white LEDs and your red LEDs, and they can be running with a temperature of 80 degrees Celsius, which is roughly about 160, 170 degrees Fahrenheit. They can be just fine. But if you run an ultraviolet LED at that temperature, it's going to start degrading a lot faster. And they've actually gotten white LEDs or blue LEDs up to the point now where they can handle 120, 150 degrees Celsius, no problem. But that kills every ultraviolet LED I'm aware of very quickly. So you can't just take your existing grow light fixture that works fine with your white and red LEDs and throw some ultraviolet LEDs on there and expect them to work long term. I mean, you can just throw them on, but it's not going to work long term. And then the other problem with that is because human eyes can't see ultraviolet light, you can't tell, unless you own this multi-$1,000 spectradiometer, you can't tell if the ultraviolet LEDs are working still, or if they've degraded, how much light they're putting off. So there are definite challenges in terms of incorporating ultraviolet in.
So, real quick there, in the
Yeah.
real world, what could happen is I could see a manufacturer selling a light that's not cooled properly. They haven't put the engineering or the money into keeping those LEDs cool. They sell an LED, and yes, it has UV. That light has
When
UV
you first
as
turn
part
it
of the
on.
spectrum when you first turn it on. Yeah, they deliver what they said. However, if you were to go fast forward 6 months or a year down the road, the basic whites and the reds are still going to run because they can handle the abuse. But you're saying those UVs, they're still pulling maybe electricity, but they're not putting out any they're not putting out any UV photons. So you end up with a spectrum that has what you bought, but it's no
Minus
longer
the
got
UV.
UV in it.
Yeah.
And that's not because they didn't sell it to you or put it in there, it's because they didn't engineer it properly to maintain and actually last as long as the other colors.
And that's not the only problem. So another issue is we have a lot of experience as humans in dealing with visible light. We know that glass lets all colors of visible light through. Glass, however, blocks UVB light. It lets UVA light through fairly well, but again, the shorter the wavelength of UVA, the more that normal window glass will block. So it's, unless you own the expensive instrumentation, you don't know whether something is blocking ultraviolet light or not. And we've seen numerous fixtures on the market where they put plastic in front of UV lenses. And in fact, 14 years ago when Black Dog first got started, some of our very, very, very first lights, we incorporated ultraviolet LEDs in, and the LEDs actually had plastic lenses in front of them. And as you recall, within just a few tens of hours of running the light, the lens on top of the UV LED starts turning brown. And after just a couple dozens of hours of running the light, the plastic on top of the LEDs turns black and no light is coming through there anymore. You're getting no UV. So yeah, it may have looked like you were getting UV to begin with. And it wasn't that the UV LED was getting too hot. It was simply that the material was incompatible with ultraviolet light. And that is because a lot of plastics, in fact, the vast majority of plastics, are affected by ultraviolet light. The ultraviolet light breaks apart the very long chains of polymers and plastics and causes them to turn yellow and degrade. You've probably seen this with plastic items that have been exposed to sunlight. They tend to turn yellow and then brown and then start breaking apart.
Yeah, the most common is nowadays everyone has these clear phone cases that get yellowing, and now they try to sell ones that they claim won't yellow. And so that, I assume, was a UV issue with those clear plastics.
So what they do to make the plastics UV stable is they put UV absorbing or UV blocking compounds in the plastic. It's essentially like giving sunscreen to the plastic. So you mix these compounds in, they absorb the ultraviolet or reflect it, and that means that the plastic doesn't turn yellow, doesn't get brittle with exposure to ultraviolet light. So great, that's good. But if you're putting that plastic then in front of a UV LED, you're also blocking or absorbing all the ultraviolet light. And again, without a multi-$1,000 instrument, you would never know because humans can't see it. So unless you have a spectradiometer, you can't tell whether the UV is actually making it through your lens or not. And we see a lot of lights on the market that have these secondary lenses made of polycarbonate plastic, which has UV stabilizer added to it to prevent it from turning yellow, because even normal white LEDs do put off just enough, just a tiny fraction of UV, but over hundreds or thousands of hours, it's enough ultraviolet light to start causing most plastics to get brittle and turn yellow or brown. So if you're putting a plastic lens in front of a LED, whether it's for human use or horticultural use, you generally have to have UV stabilizing compounds in there or the plastic will turn yellow, start blocking light. But then if you put an ultraviolet LED behind the lens, yeah, you're blocking all of the ultraviolet that's coming out from the UV LED. So the fixture may actually technically have ultraviolet LEDs in it, but that doesn't mean that any ultraviolet light is coming out.
So the challenges of UV LEDs I've heard from you, first you've got heat issues, they're not as stable. Then you've also got these issues of that you have to bring them to the table properly and that you can't put them behind plastics or the wrong materials.
And it's a larger material problem as well, because it's not just a lens putting in front of the LED itself. You have to worry about all of the materials the fixture is made out of. If the fixture has a plastic housing, well, that has to be UV stable now. Ultraviolet light, like any light, gets reflected around inside the fixture, so you have to worry about, is the printed circuit board lamination material that is on top of the board they actually mount the LEDs to, is that ultraviolet stable? Is the insulation on the wires that are feeding that circuit board ultraviolet stable, or is it going to turn brittle and fall apart and break off and cause a short over time? There's all sorts of things you have to consider when you're properly engineering a light that contains ultraviolet. And it's not that you have to think about these things just to make a light that looks good and looks like it's ultimately sellable and may even look good for 100 hours of running. But after 500 hours of running or 1,000 hours of running, it may completely fall apart if you did not engineer it correctly to begin with, and then you don't have what you paid for anymore.
So if we look at all these challenges, and then we haven't even spoken really about the cost, the UV LEDs cost significantly, many times more than the whites and reds, the common LEDs you were talking
Orders
about.
of magnitude more.
Yeah, much more, as we know. So if you sit back and you say, well, wow, if UV really works and does all these things and the science backs that up, why isn't everyone including it in their fixture? Well, we've just given you a number of reasons. One is engineering. They've got to engineer the fixture to stay cooler and keep the LEDs cooler if they're going to continue to deliver that UV over the lifetime of the fixture. Then you've got the material concerns about how you package the LED in your fixture, whether it's the housing or the lens in front of it. You have to think about all these material issues. And then on top of that, we can layer the cost. So if you start to take all those three major factors and you really think about them, you can start to really understand why most manufacturers don't go through the process of including UV in their fixture. Also, it is somewhat novel. We do believe in it, but a lot of people haven't quite tested it and understood that it does make an impact. We've been deploying UV in our fixtures for how long, Kevin? How long has Black Dog been putting UV in our fixtures?
So that has been what has set Black Dog apart from the very beginning. The very first light fixture we ever sold had ultraviolet in it, and we have never sold a grow light that did not have ultraviolet in it.
Okay, so 14 years plus we've been selling lights with UV, so we do know these downfalls, we do know the challenges, we've got them dialed in, and we deal with the cost implications, all of that, and what we try to bring to the table are really the benefits, as we spoke about before. Why do we deal with the cost of it, the engineering challenges, the cooling challenges, all those challenges? Why do that? Why? Because the benefits we spoke about, right? You brought up plant shape and size and the morphology of the plant and how it's going to grow. It adds the additional strength to the plant and that it can help reduce disease and pest issues. Also, and this is where most of our listeners and growers do care a lot, is it's really going to increase that quality. It's going to bring up the quality. One other little factor we've talked about here in the office, and we do talk about with our customers and our customers note, is that it can increase not only the quality at the top, but it increases penetration, can get you better yields down below. Why is that? Because you have higher energy that can bleed down into the canopy?
So you might like to think that plants are really good, really efficient at taking light and converting it into energy, but the truth is that most plants are actually pretty bad at it. In fact, the most efficient plant that we've found so far in terms of converting light into energy is sugarcane, and it only manages to convert 8 to 12 at best % of light into energy. So a lot of the problem there is that leaves are not capturing all of the light. If you go on the underside of a leaf and you look up towards light, you can see plenty of light coming through the leaf. Now that light has been partially absorbed by the leaf, some of it is captured by molecules in the leaf and then re-radiated. But in this process, you're always losing energy. Unfortunately, second law of thermodynamics says you're always going to increase the entropy or the disorder in things, and basically, in layman's terms, everything's going to end up as heat eventually. So as light is shining through the leaf, a lot of it ends up as heat. A lot of it comes through the other side of the leaf, having lost some energy and therefore shifted to a longer or redder wavelength of light. So if you start with nothing but red photons at the top of your canopy, the first time it goes through a leaf, the photons that were absorbed and then re-emitted are going to be shifted beyond the red wavelengths, and then they're no longer going to be useful for photosynthesis. But if you start with a blue photon at the top of the canopy, well, then it might make it through the first leaf and be shifted to a green photon, and then it might make it through the second leaf and be shifted to a red photon that it can still be then captured by the third leaf down and used for photosynthesis. Well, if you start with ultraviolet at the top of your canopy, it has even more energy, so it can make it through even more leaves on its way through. Even though it doesn't end up as an ultraviolet photon at the bottom of the canopy, it still started off, because it started off with more energy at the top, it can penetrate further into the canopy and therefore get you a denser, more productive canopy.
Now that to me was a fun part in learning about spectrum when I got involved with Black Dog and really starting to understand this stuff. Is it's mind blowing to think about these photons literally going through leaves. You know, we see light on the other side of a leaf. It's not perfectly black. It's not blocking all the light. And yes, we just think of that as, oh, I can see the light through, but it's photons literally passing through the leaf, coming out the other side, and being used by a leaf below it.
And some, in fact, the majority are passing through the leaf completely unhindered. They never hit anything. But it is the photons that do hit something in that leaf and scatter that lose energy in that process that really make the difference between having a red heavy spectrum at the top of your canopy versus a ultraviolet. And we go beyond just ultraviolet. We put deep violet between 400 and 450 nanometer LEDs in our fixtures as well, because it specifically increases canopy penetration and ends up increasing your yield per square foot. And then with the ultraviolet benefits in terms of creating a shorter, more compact, bushier plant, we, with the introduction or the inclusion of the violet and ultraviolet LEDs, end up with double to triple the industry standard yield per square foot growing under our lights. And that's why we do it. It's not because we want to make the cheapest fixture. Those violet and ultraviolet LEDs are ridiculously expensive. There's the engineering challenges of putting them in. There's the challenges of keeping them happy and producing light for 5 years of continuous use. In fact, I've got lights running in my basement that have been going now for 8 or 9 years, 24/7, and they have not lost more than a few percent of their original ultraviolet output.
That's amazing. You know, all this stuff, like we said, we have these engineering challenges, the cost challenges of UV, the cooling challenges, all of those things come together. And yeah, we still include it. Why? Because our goal is to always put out the best light possible, regardless of the cost, right? We battle cost all the time. We try to keep it affordable for the customers, but our goal is to really put out the best spectrum possible. And based on everything you're saying, we can start to understand why a part of our spectrum is UV, why we take the time to deal with the engineering, the cost, and all of that. So one of the reasons we decided to talk about this today is, you know, we went to MJ Biz last year in Vegas, and we've seen more and more in the industry. We are seeing more UV, right? We're seeing it crop up. Again, we've been doing it for almost 15 years now, and now we're seeing these companies, and some of these companies have been around for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, not as long as us, but they've been around for a minute. And now, and some of them even thrown shade at us for including UV, but now we're seeing a shift, you know, like a color shift towards UV. Why are we seeing that?
So I think enough people are starting to read the research, even see the benefits for themselves of using UV, or they've seen a friend who's tried UV and they see the difference with it. But so there's definitely a trend in the industry of more incorporating ultraviolet in the spectrum. However, the vast majority of fixtures out there are not putting UV LEDs in their regular grow light fixture for a number of reasons that we've brought up before. One is the challenge of keeping them cool. If you've got them on the same heat sink, the same thing that's supposed to be keeping them cool as your white and your red LEDs, and you're running your white and your red LEDs really warm because they can take it technically, well, then you're going to fry your ultraviolet LEDs. But again, since people can't see ultraviolet and the vast majority of people don't have the instrumentation, we see companies out there that are, okay, we'll just throw some UV LEDs on and we'll, hey, we've got ultraviolet in our fixture now. And they know that the vast majority of people out there are not going to be checking on their fixture 100 hours down the road of use and saying, oh, I've lost all my ultraviolet. So you pay for it, You think you've got it, but you don't actually have it. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of, and there's a couple reasons for this, is a separate ultraviolet bar. So we're seeing a lot of add-on fixtures or add-on bars where you're getting ultraviolet, and they've put a bunch of ultraviolet LEDs. Sometimes they'll incorporate infrared LEDs on the same bar, which doesn't really make sense to me. But anyhow, it's all the spectrum that they should have in their grow light, but they're making it a supplemental thing that you have to add on to their main grow light to get the spectrum you actually want. The problem with putting things in a separate bar, several issues with that. One, maybe they've engineered it to keep the ultraviolet LEDs cool enough, maybe not. Again, you don't know and you can't tell without really expensive instrumentation and running the light for a long time and tracking the amount of UV it's putting out. Two, you have no idea how much UV that bar is putting out. I have almost never seen any documentation of exactly how many photons of ultraviolet light these supplemental bars are putting off. So you can get documentation on how many photons, the ppf, of your grow light, but then if you want to match the sun's 3% ultraviolet, you need 3% of that number of photons of ultraviolet light. Well, how do you match that up if you don't know how much ultraviolet this bar is putting off? It's basically impossible to do on your own, unless, again, you have some $5,000 instrumentation. Third is that you've got a bar, and the rest of your light may be a 4x4-foot giant bar light, and you're putting one bar in there. Well, you're ending up with a strip of ultraviolet light where the rest of your light is being spread out evenly across your canopy, but you've got just one strip of ultraviolet. So the plants directly under that bar are going to get way more UV than the plants that are further away from it, and that makes dosing it very difficult because you can't overdo on UV or you're going to kill or damage the plants that are directly under the bar. But then the plants that are further away are not getting enough ultraviolet light to see the benefits. So having it as a separate bar makes it virtually impossible to evenly distribute the ultraviolet throughout your canopy so that all the plants can get the benefit without damaging the plants that are directly under the bar.
So it's about integrating that UV with the rest of your spectrum. And if I've got a big, 3x3 fixture here, a bar light, and then I stick one bar over here off to the side that's got UV, I'm not getting UV over my entire canopy.
Even if you put it in the middle of your fixture, it's still going to be a strip of higher intensity ultraviolet light immediately under that bar than off to the sides. But there is another reason why making the bar, besides just the engineering issues of keeping the ultraviolet LEDs cooler, there is a completely nonsensical reason why companies, at least completely nonsensical to me, why companies are making their ultraviolet and infrared, which I think we've talked about infrared before and how it increases photosynthetic efficiency with the Emerson effect. So infrared is above 700 nanometers, ultraviolet is below 400 nanometers, but there's a body out there called the Design Lights Consortium, which has been tasked by utility companies. It was originally set up by electric utility companies because utility companies wanted to encourage people to become more energy efficient. And the DLC was set up a long time ago, back before LED lights were common by any means, because, for example, there were, for those of us old enough to remember, compact fluorescent bulbs. And for a while in the early 90s through the late 90s, compact fluorescent bulbs were seen as the future because they were way more efficient than the incandescent bulbs. And almost anything is way more efficient than an incandescent bulb. There's a reason why the old easy bake ovens used an incandescent bulb. It's basically a heater that happens to put off some light. But Design Lights Consortium was set up by the utility companies because some utility companies were giving rebates to people to buy these compact fluorescent bulbs, but then cheap, poorly manufactured bulbs were being created and sold. And so people would buy these, they'd get a rebate from their utility company. The bulb would actually burn out within tens of hours of use because they were so poorly made. And so the utility company is out the money it gave the customer for a rebate. The customer was saying, oh, these bulbs are crap, they don't last, I'm going to buy an incandescent bulb instead. So the utility companies got together and created this body called the Design Lights Consortium to basically try and enforce some standards if they're going to give out rebates, that they want the rebates to actually make sense. They don't want to give out a rebate for something that is ineffective, inefficient, or is just going to break so that the customer is going to go back to the old technology. So several years ago, the Design Lights Consortium started getting into looking at horticultural grow lights as well. So they put together a standard that dictates how energy efficient the fixture needs to be in order to qualify for their DLC approval, which then can get you a rebate from your utility company. Now, when DLC put together this standard, they decided that they were only going to count photons from 400 to 700 nanometers, the visible wavelength, because number one, those photons were arbitrarily defined as and labeled as photosynthetic active radiation. Well, it is true that in general, 400 to 700 nanometers is required for photosynthesis. If you only give a plant 730 nanometer wavelengths, it is not going to photosynthesize. But Emerson, back in the 1950s, proved that if you do give plants 730 nanometer wavelength infrared photons, that increases photosynthetic efficiency. In fact, it increases it more than giving them two 660 nanometer photons. If you have one 660 nanometer photon and one 730 nanometer photon, that is worth more to the plant than two 660 nanometer photons. So back in the 1950s, they proved that, okay, plants use energy outside of the 400 to 700 nanometer wavelengths for photosynthesis. Is it sufficient on its own to just have infrared light for photosynthesis? No, but it is useful, and in fact, it is more useful than just increasing more of the stuff in the PAR range. In addition, they've shown that ultraviolet light does actually trigger photosynthesis, not as efficiently as stuff in the PAR range, but it does. But for all the other reasons we've already gone over, plants respond to exposure to ultraviolet light in a way that makes them grow better. They grow more compact, they yield more. And so in terms of photosynthesis, is adding UV giving you more photosynthesis? No, but it's giving you higher yield, which is ultimately what you want. So Design Lights Consortium said, well, PAR, or photosynthetic active radiation, is defined from 400 to 700 nanometers. So we're only going to count photons in that when we're actually considering how efficient the light is. When pointed out to them by myself and others that there are papers out there showing that photons outside of these wavelengths are actually used by plants and are useful in growth, they said, well, yeah, but it's mostly just the 400 to 700, so that's all we're going to count. And the other thing is, a lot of the testing laboratories out there that Design Lights Consortium partners up with, that they use for testing to make sure that the light bulbs they were testing or light fixtures they were testing actually comply with the requirements, only have the equipment because they've been doing testing for human purpose lighting, human use lighting for their entire existence. So they only have the equipment to look at light in the 400 to 700 nanometer wavelength range. So because the vast majority of their testing companies could not handle photons outside of that range, they said, well, we're going to just declare that we're only going to count 400 to 700 nanometer photons in the efficiency. So if you deliberately put a infrared 730 nanometer LED in, or if you put in a UV LED into your fixture, you're putting energy into those to get light of ultraviolet or infrared wavelengths out, but that light is not counted in the DLC's efficiency measurement. So that means that if you're trying to create a spectrum that actually grows plants the best by incorporating ultraviolet and infrared in the fixture, and you're doing it in the entire fixture so that the light is evenly spread. You don't just have a splotch of UV here and a splotch of infrared there, but you're actually distributing it over the entire canopy evenly. Well, the DLC penalizes you for that because they're not counting any of the photons that you're generating for that, even though you're putting energy into creating those. So if you're trying to create a light with an ideal spectrum for growing plants, it is very easy to then make it not qualify for the DLC requirements for energy efficiency. So a lot of manufacturers now are starting to put their ultraviolet and their infrared LEDs in separate fixtures so that they can get their main fixture certified as DLC compliant, and then their separate fixture that is just UV and infrared, well, that's not DLC compliant, but hey, if you want to grow plants well, you can add this on, and then you'll get something, better. It's not evenly distributing that light across your canopy. And oh, by the way, if you look at the specs on these add-on bars, most of the time they don't have a warranty, or they have a very short, different warranty than the mainline fixture. Because the manufacturers themselves recognize that they're not engineering them properly, and because it's just kind of an add-on, most customers don't think about that. Well, they look at the big expensive main fixture and they say, oh, well, this has a 5-year warranty, so I'm fine. And then I'll add these 2 ultraviolet bars on, and they forget to look, oh, there's no warranty on that.
Well, and another driving factor is the DLC there, right? As one of the requirements to be certified by the DLC is you have to have a 5-year warranty available. And so if they're not going for DLC and they do have a fixture they are going for DLC with, if they're not going for DLC on a certain fixture, they really don't have to worry about the warranty period, where they're forced to have a 5-year warranty or at least make that available for a DLC certified fixture. So you've covered a lot of ground here in terms of, we started with trying to explain and trying to get people to understand and help bring it down why UV is beneficial, why you can use it in your garden, why you should use it in your garden, and what it can or can't do for you. So if you are real interested and this has piqued your interest in wanting to include UV in your garden, we also said early on we'd give you a list of things to think about or look at before you deploy that or before making that purchasing decision. And so we said we would give that. So at the end here, we'll try to wrap up some of the stuff. Kevin laid out a lot of good points you need to be thinking about. So to sum those up, we're talking about, one is how is it deployed in that, is there a lens in front of it? Is that lens allowing the UV through? Will it continue to allow the UV through? So is it glass that's going to allow it to pass through? If it's plastic, is it going to pass the UV through? Probably not. If it's going to block it, it's going to turn yellow and haze, and then you're going to block all the light. So how it's deployed and how it's put into the fixture is important. You're going to want to look at that. Make sure the company understands that.
And then, of course, we talked about knowing your dose. Natural sunlight has 3% UV, so any plant that's growing outside in most any sunny location is going to be constantly exposed to UV, not just the last 3 weeks of flower. It's going to be constantly exposed from the time it is poking out of the ground as a little seedling. And if the light fixture you're looking at advises you to only use it for a couple hours a day, last few weeks of flower, that probably means it's putting out more UV light than you should have for a healthy dose all throughout the grow. And if you're only using it at the end, you might be able to eke out some quality benefits at the end, but you're not getting all the other advantages of ultraviolet throughout the entire grow cycle in terms of making your plant more compact and more productive, more flower sites, increasing your yield, as well as making it more resistant to insects and pathogens.
But so that brings me to my next point, which is documentation or specifics. You want to be able to look at the documentation and find out what exactly, because UV there's UVA, UVB, UVC, and there's different LEDs inside of those ranges even that you can get your hands on. So making sure that there's proper documentation and specifications so you can make these proper decisions as how much do you need, where do you need to deploy it, how long should you deploy it, how much you're getting, how does it mix with your other spectrum if you're indeed trying to do it with a standalone spectrum or a standalone fixture with another fixture. You've really got to try and balance that out. And as Kevin said, it does take some calculations.
And that's another thing where I see a lot of manufacturers making some interesting choices in terms of wording. So a lot of fixtures out there are using 405 nanometer LEDs, and they call those ultraviolet. And it is true that they put out some ultraviolet light, because a 405 nanometer LED is not only going to put out 405 nanometers, it puts out what looks like a bell curve of light across the spectrum. And so a 405 nanometer LED is going to put out about 30 to 40% of its light in the 400 nanometer and below But again, it's going to put out very little light that's 390 nanometers. So it's barely bleeding into UV, but manufacturers are calling this ultraviolet light. It's not clear that you're getting the same benefits from that. It does help with canopy penetration, but again, it depends on how much you've got in there, and it's almost never documented.
So again, good documentation and specifications. If they don't, either they don't know, which is bad, or they do know and they're not sharing it, which is also, in our mind, bad. So you've got that. Next, you've got part of kind of like how they deploy it in terms of, is there a lens in front of it? Is it going to block the light? You also have to worry about the engineering of the cooling system. You want to make sure those UV LEDs are kept cool. They are not stable like whites or reds. They cannot be heated up the same way. You know, we play with other air-cooled fixtures out there. People look at our fans and they wonder why. Well, a lot of it is we want to take care of the LEDs, not just the whites and reds and blues that you're used to, but the UVs and IRs, those really sensitive ones. That's why we have air-cooled fixtures to maintain them. We've tested a lot of these convection cooled that aren't using forced air, that aren't using fans, and they're hot enough to bake a cookie on them. Literally, we can tell with the Fleur, you could literally put a cookie on there and bake it on the back of their fixture. That is going to destroy a UV LED. Now you might think, well, maybe it's not that one that's heating up, but the whole system is that warm and it's going to take in that heat. And that again is why we care about cooling. On top of that, as Kevin mentioned, warranty period is something you should care about. You should check the warranty, make sure it's sufficient for what you expect, and make sure it even exists, because a lot of the UV fixtures we've seen now literally have 0 warranty. You buy it, you're done. The other final thing Kevin was speaking about as far as having a UV fixture that's separate and not necessarily integrated properly is the UV distribution in your canopy. You don't want, if you have a 4x4 area you're lighting up with a single fixture, which is fairly common commercially these days, I don't want just the middle 2 square feet to get UV. I want the whole 4x4, 16 square feet to get a nice dose of UV in an even distributed manner. So again, you've got how it's deployed. Does it have a lens in front of it? Is there proper documentation, including spectrum graphs and how much UV you're getting, so you can do it, as Kevin said, you could properly deploy it and get the effect you're looking for in your garden, not too much, not too little, but just the right amount. Also, is it cooled properly? And then do you have a proper warranty on there? And of course, all this boils down to, at the end of the day, are you getting that even distribution of UV you're looking for? These are all things you should think about if you want to deploy and bring UV into your garden. And again, hopefully you understand at the beginning of this conversation where we covered why UV, why you'd want to bring it to your garden. Because yeah, it can add a little bit of cost, but the benefits are there. I mean, our customers would swear by it, the top shelf they're growing. It does. I've smoked a lot of cannabis. I've seen a lot of cannabis grown. I've sampled a lot of cannabis, and I will tell you this, that yes, you do see a difference. You know, some of these guys, we like to think of it as the perfect world. You got a lot of people that love and say you can't get outdoor without the full spectrum of that. Yeah, I would agree. If you're just using a basic white spectrum, you're not getting what you get outdoors. But we also know growing outdoors, you've got wind, rain, bugs, all kinds of stuff to deal with that you don't get indoors. So we get the controlled environment of indoors, but by getting a truly complete spectrum from UV to IR and everything in the middle, you're really going to see those benefits. You're going to get the colors you would have never seen if you'd grown under HPS indoors or a basic white spectrum. You're going to get the standard green bud. You're not going to get the coloration. You're not going to get that benefit. You're not going to get the increased active compounds. So it's kind of the best of both worlds to grow with a full spectrum in an indoor controlled environment. You really do get that benefit, and you get that true almost sun-kissed type of bud that you don't get without growing outdoors under other lights.
And one other quick note there, speaking of outdoors, is one of my favorite features about having ultraviolet in our fixtures. This time of year, we're recording this in spring, Colorado. It's time to start your garden, and I always start hundreds of vegetable seeds indoors every year under our light fixtures. I've been doing this longer than I've worked for Black Dog, so I used to start them under fluorescent light fixtures or metal halide or high pressure sodium. And I would spend a week every year slowly hardening off or acclimating the plants that I had started indoors under grow lights to get them used to full sunlight. And a lot of people that start plants indoors and move them outdoors are probably very familiar with this. If you start them on your windowsill or you start them under a grow light, and then you move them out to full sun, the plants generally fry. They turn white, the leaves turn white, and it's basically the plant equivalent of a sunburn. because they've never been exposed to ultraviolet light before. And it's just like if you stay bundled up all winter and not exposed to the sun, you don't go to the tanning salon, and then you go to Aruba for a vacation, well, yeah, you're going to burn to a crisp if you just go out on the beach with no suntan lotion on. So one of the things I love about our lights is I can start seedlings indoors under our fixtures and plop them straight into full sunlight. And because they were exposed to the same amount of ultraviolet under our lights that they would get under the sun, they handle it just fine. I don't have to harden them off at all. They can go straight from my basement, where they've never seen natural sunlight before, straight to full sun, no problems.
So for those that are starting indoors and moving outdoors, whether it's vegetables or you've got a large cannabis crop and you're trying to get it out in the spring and get those starts done early to get the big plants, by growing under here, you can eliminate the hardening off, which is either going to be exposing them to light for shortened periods of time or using a traditional shade cloth or something like that. We can eliminate all that just by using a true complete spectrum and not some basic white spectrum that you'd find in most lights out there. So thanks for joining us today. We've spent a lot of time covering UV. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned something. And again, keep those questions coming, the feedback. We love it. Hope you enjoyed this. And don't forget, not only is it on our website and on YouTube, it's on all the major podcast platforms, whether it's iTunes, Pandora, any of those. So feel free to reach out with any comments, questions, any follow-up you'd like us to do on this. But thanks again for taking time to educate yourself on the garden, and happy gardening.